Chapter XXVIII of His Grace of Osmonde by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter XXVIII. Sir John rides out of town. Tom Tantillion had not appeared at the ball, having otherwise entertained himself for the evening, but at an hour when most festivities were at an end, and people were returning from them, rolling through the streets in their coaches, the young man was sitting at a corner table in Cribb's coffee house, surrounded by glasses and jolly companions and clouds of tobacco smoke. One of these companions had been to the ball and left it early, and had fallen to talking of great personages he had seen there, and describing the beauties who had shone the brightest, among them speaking of my Lady Dunstanwolde, and the swoon which had so amazed those who had seen it. "I was within 10 feet of her," says he, "and watching her as a man always does when he is near enough. Jack Oxon stood behind her and was speaking low over her shoulder, but she seemed to take little note of him, and looking straight before her, and of a sudden she stands upright, her black eyes wide open, as if some sound had startled her, and the next minute falls like a woman dropping dead, and lies among her white and silver like one carven out of stone. One who knows her well, old Sir Chris Crowell, says she hath never fallen in a swoon before since she was born. Gad, 'twas a strange sight, 'twas so sudden." He had just finished speaking, and was filling his glass again, when a man strode into the room in such haste that all turned to glance at him. He was in riding dress, and was flushed and excited, and smiling as if to himself. "Drawer," he called, "bring me coffee and brandy, and, damme, be in haste." Young Tantillion nudged his nearest companion with his elbow. "Jack Oxon," he said. "Where rides the fellow at this time of night?" "Eh, Jack," he said, aloud, "art on a journey already after shining at the Court ball?" Sir John started, and seeing who spoke, answered with an ugly laugh. "Ay," said he, "I ride to the country in hot haste. I go to WICKBEN in Essex, to bring back a thing I once left there." "'Twas a queer place to leave valuables," said Tom. "A village of tumble down thatched cottages. Was it a love token or a purse of gold?" Sir John gave his knee a sudden joyous slap and laughed aloud. "'Twas a little thing," he replied, "but 'twill bring back fortune if I find it, and help me to pay back old scores, which is a thing I like better." And his grin was so ugly that Tom and his companions glanced aside at each other, believing that he was full of liquor already, and ready to pick a quarrel if they continued their talk. This they were not particularly inclined to, however, and began a game of cards, leaving him to himself to finish his drink. This he did, quickly tossing down both brandy and coffee the instant they were brought to him, and then striding swaggering from the room and mounting his horse, which waited in the street, and riding clattering off over the stones at a fierce pace. "Does he ride for a wager?" said Will Lovell, dealing the cards. "He rides for some ill purpose, I swear," said Tom Tantillion. "Jack Oxon never went in haste towards an honest deed, but to play some devil's trick 'tis but nature to him to go full speed." But what he rode for they never heard, neither they nor anyone else who told the story, though 'twas sure that if he went to WICKBEN he came back to town for a few hours at least, for there were those who saw him the next day, but only one there was who spoke with him, and that one my Lady Dunstanwolde herself. Her ladyship rode out in the morning hoping, 'twas said, that the fresh air and exercise would restore her strength and spirits. She rode without attendant and towards the country, and in the high road Sir John Oxon joined her. "I did not know he had been out of town," she said, when the mystery was discussed. "He did not say so. He returned to Dunstanwolde House with me, and we had talked together. He had scarce left me when I remembered that I had forgot to say a thing to him I had wished to say. So I sent Jenfrey forth quickly to call him back. He had scarce had time to turn the street's corner, but Jenfrey returned, saying he was not within sight." "Whereupon you sent a note to his lodgings, wasn't not so?" asked Sir Christopher. "Yes," answered her ladyship, "but he had not returned there." "Nor ever did," said Sir Christopher, whenever the mystery was referred to afterwards, "nor ever did, and where he went to from that hour only the devil knows, for no man or woman that one has heard of has ever clapped eyes on him since." This was, indeed, the mysterious truth. After he entered the panelled parlour at Dunstanwolde House, it seemed that none had seen him, for the fact was that by a strange chance even the lacquey who should have been at his place in the entrance hall had allowed himself to be ensnared from his duty by a pretty serving wench, and had left his post for a few minutes to make love to her in the servants' hall, during which time 'twas plain Sir John must have left the house, opening the entrance door for himself unattended. "Lord," said the lacquey in secret to his mates, "my gizzard was in my throat when her ladyship began to question me. 'Did you see the gentleman depart, Martin?' she says. ''Twas you who attended him to the door, of a surety.' 'Yes, your ladyship,' stammers I, ''twas I, and I marked he seemed in haste.' 'Did you not observe him as he walked away?' says my lady. 'Did you not see which way he went?' 'To the left he turned, my lady,' says I, cold sweat breaking out on me, for had I faltered in my answer she would have known I was lying, and guessed I had broke her orders by leaving my place by the door. And Lord have mercy on a man when she finds he has tricked her. There is a flash in her eyes like lightning, and woe betide him it falls on. The truth was that from the moment the door of the panelled parlour closed behind him, the gentleman's days were ended for all I saw of him, for I saw him no more." And there was none who saw him, for from that time he disappeared from his lodgings, from the town, from England, from the surface of the earth, as far as any ever heard or discovered, none knowing where he went, or how, or wherefore. Had he been a man of greater worth or importance, or one who had made friends, his so disappearing would have aroused a curiosity and excitement not easily allayed. But a vicious wastrel who has lost hold even on his well-home companions in evil doing, and has no friends more faithful, is like indeed, on dropping out of the world's sight, to drop easily and lightly from its mind, his loss being a 9 days' wonder, and nothing more. So it was with this one, who had had his day of being the fashion, and had broken many a fine lady's brittle heart, and living to be no longer the mode, had seen the fragile trifles cemented together again, to be almost as good as new. When he was gone he was forgot quickly and, indeed, but talked about because her ladyship of Dunstanwolde had last beheld him, and on the afternoon had been entertaining company in the panelled parlour when the lacquey had brought back the undelivered note with which Jenfrey had waited 3 hours at the lost man's lodgings in the hope that he would return to them, which he did no more. "'Tis a good riddance to all, my lady, wheresoever he be gone," said Sir Christopher, sitting nursing his stout knee in the blue parlour a week later, for her ladyship had had a sudden fancy to have the panelled room made wholly new and decorated before the return of his Grace from France. "'Tis a good riddance to all." Then he fell to telling stories of the man, of the creditors he had left in the lurch, having swindled them of their very heart's blood, and that every day there was heard of some poor tradesman he had ruined, till 'twas a shame to hear it told, and there were worse things yet. "By the Lord," he said, "the ruin one man's life can bring about, the heartbreak and the shame, 'tis enough to make even a sinner as old as I repent to come upon them face to face. Eh, my lady?" looking at her suddenly. "Thou must get back the roses thou hast lost these 3 days nursing Mistress Anne, or his Grace will be at odds with us every one." For Mistress Anne had been ailing, and her sister, being anxious and watching over her, had lost some of her glorious bloom, which was indeed a new thing to see. At this moment the roses had dropped from her cheeks, and she smiled strangely. "They will return," she said, "when his Grace does." She asked questions of the stories Sir Christopher had told, and showed anxiousness concerning the poor people who had been so hardly treated. "I have often thought," she said, "that so rich a woman as I should set herself some task of good deeds to do. 'Twould be a good work to take in hand, the undoing of the wrongs a man who is lost has left behind him. Why should not I, Clo Wildairs, take in hand the undoing of this man's?" And she rose up suddenly and stood before him, straight and tall, the colour coming out on her cheeks as if life flooded back there. "Thou!" he cried, gazing at her in loving wonder. "Why shouldst thou, Clo?" None among them had ever understood her and her moods, and he surely did not understand this one, for it seemed as if a fire leapt up within her, and she spoke almost wildly. "Because I would atone for all my past," she said, "and cleanse myself with unceasing mercies, and what I cannot undo, do penance for, that I may be worthy." She broke off and drew her hand across her eyes, and ended with a strange little sound, half laugh. "Perhaps all men and women have been evil," she said, "and some are, some seem fated, and when my lord Duke comes back, I shall be happy, happy in spite of all, and I scarce dare to think my joy may not be taken from me. Is joy always torn away after it has been given to a human thing, given for just so long as will make loss madness?" "Eh, my lady?" he said, blundering. "Thou art fearful, just as another woman might be. 'Tis not like Clo Wildairs. Such thoughts will not make thee a happy woman." She ended with a laugh stranger than her first one, and her great black eyes were fixed on him, as he had remembered seeing her fix them when she was a child and full of some wild fancy or weird sadness. "'Tis not Clo Wildairs who thinks them," says she. "'Tis another woman. 'Twas Clo who knew John Oxon who is gone, and was as big a sinner as he, though she did harm to none but herself. And 'tis for those two, for both, I would have mercy. But I am a strong thing, and was born so, and my happiness will not die, despite whatever comes. And I am happy, and know I shall be more, and 'tis for that I am afraid." "Good Lord!" cried Sir Chris, swallowing a lump which rose, he knew not why, in his throat. "What a strange creature thou art!" His Grace's couriers went back and forth to France, and upon his estate the people prepared their rejoicings for the marriage day, and never had Camylott been so heavenly fair as on the day when the bells rang out once more, and the villagers stood along the roadside and at their cottage doors, curtsying and throwing up hats and calling down God's blessings on the new wed pair as the coach passed by, and his Grace, holding his lady's hand, showed her to his people, seeming to give her and her loveliness to them as they bowed and smiled together, she almost with joyful tears in her sweet eyes. In her room near the nurseries, at the window which looked out among the ivy, Nurse Halsell sat, watching the equipage as it made its way up the long avenue, and might be seen now and then between the trees, and her old hands trembled in her lap for very joy. And before the day was done, his Grace, knocking on the door gently, brought his Duchess to her. "And 'twas you," said her Grace, standing close by her chair and holding the old hand between her own two, which were so white and velvet warm. "And 'twas you who held him in your arms when he was but a little new-born thing, and often sang him to sleep, and were so loved by him. And he played here," and she looked about the apartment with a tremulous smile. "Yes," said his Grace, with a low laugh of joyful love, "and now I bring you to her, and 'tis my marriage day." Nurse Halsell gazed up at the eyes which glowed above her. "'Tis what his Grace hath waited long for," she said, "and he would have died an unwedded man had he not reached it at last. 'Tis sure what God ordained." And for a minute she looked straight and steady into the Duchess' face. "A man must come to his own," she said, and bent and kissed the fair hand with passionate love. But her Grace lifted the old face with her palm and stooped and kissed it fondly, gratefully. Then the Duke took his wife to the long gallery, and they stood there, he holding her close against his side, while the golden sun went down. "Here I stood and heard that you were born," he said, and kissed her red, tender mouth. "Here I stood in agony and fought my battle with my soul the first sad day you came to Camylott." And he kissed her slow and tenderly again, in memory of the grief of that past time. "And here I stand and feel your dear heart beat against my side, and look into your eyes, and they are the eyes of her who is mine, and Death himself cannot take her from me." Chapter 29 of His Grace of Osmonde by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This recording is in the public domain. At the Cow at WICKBEN. The happiness he had dreamed of was given to him, nay, he knew joy and tenderness even more high and sweet than his fancy had painted. As Camylott had been in his childhood, so he saw it again, the most beauteous home in England and the happiest, its mistress the fairest woman and the most nobly loving. And his own father and mother had found life a joyful thing, and their world full of warm hearts and faithful friends. So he and she he loved found it together. The great house was filled once more with guests and pleasures as in the olden time. The stately apartments were thrown open for entertainment. Gay cavalcades came and went from town. The forests were hunted, the moors shot over by sportsmen, and the lady who was hostess and chatelaine won renown as well as hearts, since each party of guests she entertained went back to their homes they came from, proclaiming to all her wit and gracious charm. She rode to hunt and leapt hedges as she had done when she had been Clo Wildairs. She walked the moors with the sportsmen, her gun over her shoulder. she sparkling and showing her white teeth like a laughing gipsy, and when she so walked, the black rings of her hair blown loose about her brow, her cheeks kissed fresh crimson by the wet wind, and turned her eyes upon my Lord Duke near her, and their looks met, the man who beheld saw lovers who set his own heart beating. "But is it true," asked once the great French lady who had related the history of the breaking of the horse Devil, "is it true that a poor man killed himself in despair on her last marriage, and that she lives a secret life of penance to atone, and wears a hair shirt and peas in her beautiful satin shoes, and does deeds of mercy in the dark places of the big black English city?" "A man, mad with jealous rage of her, disappeared from sight," said an English lady present, "and he might well have drowned himself from disappointment that she would not wed him and pay his debts, but 'twas more like he fled England to escape his creditors. And 'tis true she does many noble deeds in secret, but if they be done in penance for Sir John Oxon, she is a lady with a conscience that is tender indeed." That her conscience was a strangely tender thing was a thought which moved one man's heart strongly many a time. Scarce a day passed in which her husband did not mark some evidence of this, hear some word spoken, see some deed done, almost it seemed as if in atonement for imagined faults hid in her heart. He did not remark this, because he was unused to womanly mercifulness. His own mother's life had been full of gentle kindness to all about her, of acts of charity and goodness, but in the good deeds of this woman, whom he so loved, he observed an eagerness which was almost a passion. She had changed no whit in the brilliance of her spirit. In the world she reigned a queen, as she had ever done. Wheresoever she moved, life and gaiety seemed to follow, whether it was at the court, in the town, or the country. But in both town and country he found she did strange charities, and seemed to search for creatures she might aid in such places as other women had not courage to dive into. This he discovered through encountering her one day as she re-entered Osmonde House, returning from some such errand, clad in dark plain garments, her black hood drawn over her face, being thereby so disguised that but for her height and bearing he should not have recognised her. Indeed, he thought, she had not seen and would have passed him in silence. He put forth his hand and stayed her, smiling. "Your Grace," he said, "or some vision." She threw the black hood back, and her fair face and large black eyes shone out from beneath its shadows. She drew his hand up and kissed it, and held it against her cheek in a dear way which was among the sweetest of her wifely caresses. "It is like heaven, Gerald," she said, "to see your face after beholding such miseries." And when he took her in his arm and led her to the room in which they loved best to sit in and converse together, she told him of a poor creature she had been to visit, and when she named the place where she had found her, 'twas a haunt so dark and wicked that he started in alarm and wonder at her. "Nay, dear one," he said, "such dens are not for you to visit. You must not go to them again." She was sitting on a low seat before him, and she leaned forward, the black hood falling back, framing her face and making it look white. "None else dare go," she said. "None else dare go, Gerald. Such places are so hideous and so noisome, and yet there are those who are born and die there, bound hand and foot when they are born, that they may be bound hand and foot to die." She rose up as if she did not know she moved, and stood up before him, her hand upon her breast. "'Tis such as I should go," she said, "I who am happy and beloved. After all, after all, 'tis such as I who should go, and carry love and pity, love and pity." And she seemed Love's self and Pity's self, and stood transfigured. "You are a saint," he cried, "and yet I am afraid. Ah, how could any harm you?" "I am so great and strong," she said, in a still voice. "None could harm me if they would. I am not as other women, and I do not know fear. See!" and she held out her arm. "I am a Wildairs, built of iron and steel. If in a struggle I held aught in my hand and struck at a man," and her arm fell at her side suddenly, as if some horrid thought had swept across her soul like a blighting blast. She turned white and sank upon her low seat, covering her face with her hands. Then she looked up with awed eyes. "If one was so strong," she said, "should strike at a man in anger, he might strike him dead, unknowing, dead." "'Tis not a thing to think of," said his Grace, and shuddered a little. "But he would think of it," she said, "all his life through, and bear it on his soul." And she shuddered too, and in her eyes was the old look which sometimes haunted them. Surely, he thought, Nature had never before made a woman's eyes so to answer to her lover's and her lord's. They were so warm, and full of all a man's soul most craved for. He had seen them flash fire like Juno's. He had seen tears well up into them as if she had been a tender girl. He had seen them laugh like a child's. He had seen them brood over him as a young dove's might brood over her mate. But this look was unlike any other, and was as if she thought on some dark thing in another world, so far away that her mind's vision could scarce reach it, and yet could not refrain from turning towards its shadow. But this was but a cloud which his love words and nearness could dispel. This she herself told him on a time when he spoke to her of it. "When you see it," she said, "come and tell me that you love me, and that there is naught can come between our souls. As you said the day you showed me the dear rose, naught can come between, and love is more than all." "But that you know," he answered. "Life is so full of joys for those who love, and, being mated, are given by their good fortunes the power to live as their hearts lead them. These two were given all things, it seemed to the world which looked on. From one of their estates to the other they went, with the changing seasons, and with them carried happiness and peace. Her Grace, of whom the villagers had heard such tales as made them feel that they should tremble before the proud glance of her dark eyes, found that their last Duchess, whose eyes had been like violets, could smile no more sweetly. This one was somehow the more majestic lady of the two, being taller and having a higher bearing by nature, but none among them had ever beheld one who was more a woman and seemed so well to understand a woman's heart and ways. Where had she learned it? They wondered among themselves, as others had wondered the year when, as my Lady Dunstanwolde, she had been guest at Camylott, and in the gipsies' encampment had carried, so soft and tenderly, the little gipsy child in her arms. Where had she learned it? "Gerald," she said once to her husband, and pressed her hand against her heart, "'twas always here, here, lying hid, when none knew it, when I did not know it myself, when I seemed but a hard, wild creature, having only men for friends. I was woman then, and used sometimes to sit and stare at the red coals of the fire, or the red sun going down on the moors, and feel longings and pities and sadness I knew not the meaning of. And often, suddenly, I was made angry by them, and would spring up and walk away, that I might be troubled no more. But 'twas nature crying out in me that I was a woman and could be naught else." Her love and tenderness for her sister Mistress Anne increased, it seemed, hour by hour. "At Camylott, at Marlowell, at Roxholm, at Paulyn, and at Mertoun," she had said when she was married, "we must have an apartment which is Anne's. She is my saint, and I must keep a niche for her in every house, and set her in it to be worshipped." And so it was. To whichsoever of their homes they went, Mistress Anne went with them, and found always her own nest warm to receive her. "It makes me feel audacious, sister," she used to say at first, "to go from one grand house to the other, and be led to Mistress Anne's apartments in each, and they always prepared and waiting as if 'twere I who were a duchess." "You are Anne, you are Anne," said her Grace, and kissed her fondly. Sometimes she was like a gay and laughing girl, and set all the place alight with her witcheries. She invented entertainments for their guests, games and revels for the villagers, and was the spirit of all. In one of their retrospective hours Osmonde had told her of the thoughts he had dreamed on, as they had ridden homeward from the encampment of the gipsies, of his fancies of the comrade she would make for a man who lived a roving life. She had both laughed and wept over the story, clinging to his breast as she had told her own, and of her fear of his mere glance at her in those dark days, and that she had not dared to sit alone, but kept near her lord's side, lest she should ponder and remember what 'twas honest she should forget. But afterwards she planned, for their fanciful pleasure, rambling long jaunts, when they rode or walked unattended, and romanced like children, eating their simple food under broad greenwood trees or on the wide moors, with a whole world of heather, as it seemed, rolled out before them. On such a journey, setting out from London one bright morning, they rode through Essex and stopped by chance at a little village inn. 'Twas the village of WICKBEN, and on the signboard which hung swinging on a post before the small thatched house of entertainment was painted a brown cow. None knew 'twas a duke and his duchess who dismounted and entered the place. They had made sure that by their attire none could suspect them of being more than ordinary travellers, modest enough to patronise a humble place. "But Lord, what a fine pair!" said the old fellow who was the landlord. "Adam and Eve may have been such when God first made man and woman, and had stuff in plenty to build them." He was an aged man and talkative, and being eager for a chance to wag his tongue and hear travellers' adventures, attended them closely. He gave them their simple repast himself in small room, and as he moved to and fro fell to gossiping, emboldened by their friendly gaiety of speech and by her Grace's smiling eyes. "Your ladyship," he began at first in somewhat awkward, involuntary homage. "Nay, gaffer, I am no ladyship," she answered, with Clo Wildairs's unceremonious air. I am but a gipsy woman in good luck for a day, and my man is a gipsy too, though his skin is fairer than mine. We are going to join our camp near Camylott village. These horses are not ours, but borrowed, honestly. Is it not so, John Merton?" And she so laughed at his Grace with her big saucy eyes that he wished he had been indeed a gipsy man and could have kissed her openly. "Art the gipsies' queen?" asked the old man, bewitched by her. "Not she," answered his Grace, "but a plain gipsy wench who makes baskets and tells fortunes for all her good looks. Thou art flattering her, old fellow. All the men flatter her." "'Tis well, there are some to flatter me," said her Grace, showing her white teeth. "Thou dost not. But 'tis always so when a poor woman weds a man and tramps by the side of him instead of keeping him at her feet." And then they led their old host on to talk, and told him stories of what gipsies did, and of their living in tents and sleeping in the open, and of the ill luck which sometimes befell them when the lord of the manor they camped on was a hard man and evil tempered. "'Tis a duke who rules over Camylott, is it not?" the old fellow asked. "Ay," was her Grace's answer, nodding her head. "He is well enough, but his lady, Lord, but they tell me that she was a vixen before her marriage a few years gone." "I have seen her," said his Grace. "She is not ill to look at, and has done us no harm yet." "Ay, but she may," says her Grace, nodding wisely again. "Who knows what such a woman may turn out? I have seen him." She stopped, her elbows on the little round wooden table, her chin on her hands, and gave her saucy stare again. "I'll pay thee a compliment," she said. "He is a big fellow, and not unlike thee, though he be duke, and thou naught but a vagabond gipsy." Their host had hearkened to them eagerly, and now he put in a question. Was not she the beauty that was married to an old earl who left her widow? he said. Was not she Countess Dunstanwolde? "Ay," answered her Grace quietly. "Ecod!" cried the old fellow, "that minds me of a story, and 'twas a thing happened in this very house and room. Look there." He pointed with something like excitement to the window. 'Twas but seldom he had chance to tell his story, and 'twas a thing he dearly loved to do, life being but a dull thing at the Cow at WICKBEN, and few travellers passing that way. A pair so friendly and gay and ready to hearken to his chatter as these two he had not seen for years. "Look there," he said, "at that big hole in the wall." They turned together and looked at it in some wonder that her ladyship of Dunstanwolde should have had any connection with it. 'Twas indeed a big hole, and looked as if the plaster of the wall under the sill had been roughly broken and hacked. "Ay," said the host, "'tis a queer thing, and came here in a strange way, being made by a gentleman's sword, and he either wild with liquor or with rage. Never shall I forget hearing his horse's hoofs come tearing over the road, as if some man was riding for his life. I was abed, and started out of my sleep at the sound of it. 'Who's chased by the devil at this time o' night through WICKBEN village?' says I, and scarce were the words out of my mouth before the horse clatters up to the house and stops. I could hear him panting and heaving as his rider gets off and strides up to bang on the door. 'What dost thou want?' says I, putting my head out of the window. 'Come down and let me in,' answers he. 'I have no time to spare. You have a thing in your house I would find.' 'Twas a gentleman's voice, and I saw 'twas a gentleman's dress he wore, for 'twas fine cloth, and his sword had a silvered scabbard, and his hat rich plumes. 'Come down,' says he, and bangs the door again, so down I went." "Who was he?" asked her Grace slowly, for he had stopped for breath. She sat quite still as before, her round chin held in her hands, her eyes fixed on him, but there was no longer any laughter in their blackness. "Did he tell his name?" "Not then," was the answer. "Nor did he know I heard when he spoke it, breaking forth in anger. But that is to come later," and with the air of one who would have his tale heard to the most dramatic advantage. "Into this room he strides, and to the windows straight, and looks below the sill. 4 years ago,' says he, 'there was a hole here in the wall. Was it so or was it not?' And he looks at me sharp and fierce, as if he would take me by the throat if I said there had been none. 'Ay, there was a hole there long enough,' I answers him, 'but 'twas mended with new plaster at last. Your lordship can see the patch, for 'twas but roughly done.' Then he goes close to it and stares. 'Ay,' says he, 'there has been a hole mended. Old Chris did not lie.' And on that he turns to me. 'Get out of the room,' he says. 'I have a search to make here. Your wall will want another patch when I am done,' he says, 'but 'twill be made good. Go thy ways.' And he draws out his hanger, and there was sweat on his brow, and he breathed fast, as if he was wild with his anxiousness to find what he sought." "And didst leave him?" asked her Grace, as quiet as before. "For how long?" The old man grinned. "Not for long," said he, "nor did I go far. I stood outside, where I could see through the crack of the door." The Duchess nodded with an unmoved face. "He was like a man in a frenzy," the host went on. "He dug at the plaster till I thought his sword would break. He dug as if he were paid for it by the minute. He made a hole bigger than had been there before, and when 'twas made he thrusts his hand in and fumbles about, cursing under his breath, and of a sudden he gives a start and stops and pants for breath, and then draws his hand back, and it was bloody, being scratched by the stone and plaster, but he held somewhat in it, a little dusty package, and he clutches it to his breast and laughs outright. Good Lord, 'twas like a devil's laugh, 'twas so wild and joyful. 'Ha, ha!' cries he, shaking the thing in the air and stamping his foot. 'Jack Oxon comes to his own again, to his own.'" "Then," says her Grace, more slowly still, "that was his name? I have heard it before." "I heard it again," said the old story teller, eager to reach his climax, "and 'tis that ends the story so finely. 'Twas by chance talk of travellers I heard it nigh 6 months later. The very day after he stood here and searched for his package, he disappeared from sight and has not been heard of since. And the last who set eyes on him was my Lady Dunstanwolde, who is now a duchess at Camylott, where your camp is. 'Twas her name brought the story back to me." Her Grace rose, catching her breath with a laugh. She turned her face towards the window, as if, of a sudden, attracted by somewhat to be seen outside. "'Tis a good story," she said, but for a moment the crimson roses on her cheeks had shuddered to whiteness. Why, no man could tell. Her host did not see her countenance. Perhaps my lord Duke did not. "'Tis a good story," she laughed again. "And well told," added my lord Duke. Her Grace turned to them both once more. Through some wondrous exercise of her will she looked herself again. "As we are in luck to day," she said, "and it has passed the time, let us count it in the reckoning." A new, almost wild, fantastic gaiety seized her. She flung herself into her playing of the part of a gipsy woman with a spirit which was a marvel to behold. She searched his Grace's pockets and her own for pence, and counted up the reckoning on the table, saying that they could but afford this or that much, that they must save this coin for a meal, that for a bed, this to pay toll on the road. She used such phrases of the gipsy jargon as she had picked up, and made jokes and bantering speeches which set their host cackling with laughter. Osmonde had seen her play a fantastic part before on their whimsical holidays, but never one which suited her so well, and in which she seemed so full of fire and daring wit. She was no duchess, a man might have sworn, but a tall, splendid, black-eyed, laughing gipsy woman, who, to the man who was her partner, would be a fortune every day, and a fortune not of luck alone, but of gay spirit and bravery and light-hearted love. That night the moon shone white and clear, and in the mid-hours my Lord Duke waked from his sleep suddenly, and saw the brightness streaming full through the oriel window, and in the fair flood of it his love's white figure kneeling. "Gerald," she cried, clinging to him when he went to her, "'twas I awaked you. I called, though I did not speak." "I heard, as I should hear if I lay dead," he answered low. Her hair was all unbound for the night, her black wondrous hair which he so loved, and from its billowy cloud her face looked at him wild and white, her mouth quivering. "Gerald," she said, "look out with me." Together they looked forth from the wide window into the beauty of the night, up into the great vault of heaven, where the large silver moon sailed in the blue, the stars shining faintly before her soft brilliance. "We are pagans," she said, "poor pagans who oftenest seem to pray to a cruel thing we do not know, but only crouch before in terror, lest it crush us. But when we look up into such a heaven as this, its majesty and stillness seem a presence, and we dare to utter what our hearts cry out, and know we shall be heard." She caught his hand and held it to her heart, which he felt leap beneath it. "There is no power would harm a woman's child," she cried, "a little unborn thing which has not breathed, because it would wreak vengeance on herself. There is none, Gerald, is there?" And she clung to him, her uplifted face filled with such lovely, passionate woman's fear and pleading as made him sweep her to his breast and hold her silently, because he could not speak. "For I have learned to be afraid," she murmured brokenly against his breast, "and I was kneeling here to pray with all my soul, that if there were so cruel a thing 'twould kill me now, blight me, take me from you, that I might die in torture, but not bring suffering on my love and on an innocent thing." And her heart beat like some terrified caged eaglet against his own, and her eyes were wild with woe. But the wondrous stillness of the deep night enfolded them, as if nature held them in her great arms which comfort so, and her stars gazed Chapter 30. of His Grace of Osmonde by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30 On Tyburn Hill. There was none knew her as her husband did, none in the world, though so many were her friends and worshippers. As he loved her he knew her, the passion of his noble heart giving him clearer and more watchful eyes than any other. Truth was, indeed, that she herself did not know how much he saw and pondered on, and how tender his watch upon her was. The dark shadow in her eyes he had first noted, the look which would pass over her face sometimes at a moment when 'twas brightest, when it glowed with the tenderest love for himself, or with the deepest yearning over the children who were given to them as time passed, for there were born to fill their home 4 sons who were like young gods for strength and beauty, and 2 daughters, as fair things as nature ever made to promise perfect womanhood. And how she loved and tended them, and how they joyed in their young lives and worshipped and revered her. "When I was a child, Gerald," she said to their father, "I was unhappy, and 'tis a hideous thing that a child should be so. I loved none, and none loved me, and though all feared my rage and gave me my will, I was restless and savage and a rebel, though I knew not why. There were hours, I did not know their meaning, and hated them, when I was seized with fits of horrid loneliness, and would hide myself in the woods, and roll in the dead leaves, and curse myself and all things because I was wretched. I used to think that I was angered at my dogs or my horse, or some servant, or my father, and would pour forth oaths at them. But 'twas not they. Our children must be happy. They must be happy, Gerald. I will have them happy." What a mother they had in her, a creature who could be wild with play and laughter with them, who was so beauteous that even in mere babyhood they would sit upon her knee and stare at her for sheer infant pleasure in her rich bloom and great sweet eyes, who could lift and toss and rock them in her strong soft arms as if they were but flowers and she a summer wind, whose voice was music, and whose black hair was a great soft mantle 'twas their childish delight to coax her to loosen, that it might flow about her, billowing, she standing laughing beneath, and tossing it over them to hide their smallness under it as beneath a veil. She was their heroine and their young pride, and among themselves they made joyful little boasts that there was no other such lady in all England. To behold her mount her tall horse and gallop and leap hedges and gates, to hear her tell stories of the moorlands and woods, and the game hiding in nests and warrens, of the ways of dogs and hawks and horses, and soldiers and kings and queens, and of how their father had fought in battles, and of how big the world was, and how full of wonders and of joys. What other children had such pleasures in their lives? But a few months after their Grace's visit to the cow at WICKBEN, young John, who was heir and Marquis of Roxholm, had been born, following each other his 2 brothers, and later the child Daphne and her sister Anne. Last, the little Lord Cuthbert, who was told as he grew older that he was to be the hero of his house, in memory of Cuthbert de Merton, who had lived centuries ago, and in the 5 villages 'twas sworn that each son her Grace bore her husband was a finer creature than the last, and that her girl children outbloomed their brothers all. Among these young human flowers Mistress Anne reigned gentle queen and saint, but softly faded day by day, having been a fragile creature all her life, but growing more so as time passed, despite the peace she lived in and the happiness surrounding her. In her eyes, too, his Grace had seen a look which had held its mystery. They were such soft eyes, and so kind and timid, he had always loved them. In days gone by he had often observed them as they followed her sister, and had been touched by the faithful tenderness of their look. But after her marriage they seemed to follow her more tenderly still, and sometimes with a vague, piteous wonder, as if the fond creature asked herself in secret a question she knew not how to answer. More and more devout she had grown, and, above all things, craved to aid her Grace in the doing of her good deeds. To such work she gave herself with the devotion of one who would strive to work out a penance. Her own attendant was one of those whom her sister had aided, and was a young creature with a piteous little story indeed. A pretty, rosy country child of but 17 when, after her Grace's marriage, she came to Camylott to serve Mistress Anne. On her first coming my Lord Duke had marked her and the sadness of her innocent childish face and blue eyes, and had spoken of her to Anne, asking if she had met with some misfortune. A pretty, curly-headed creature, such as she could be a village beauty and dimpling with smiles, he said, but the little thing looks sometimes as if she had wept a year. Who has done her a wrong? Mistress Anne gave a little start, and bent lower over her embroidery frame, but her Grace, who was in the apartment, answered for her. "'Twas Sir John Oxon," she answered, "who has wronged so many." "What?" Osmonde cried. "Wrought he the poor thing's ruin?" "No," the Duchess replied, "but would have done it, and she, poor child, all innocent, believing herself an honest wife. He had so planned it, but fate saved her." "A mock marriage," says the Duke, "and she saved from it? How?" "Because the day she went to him to be married, as he had told her, he was not at his lodgings and did not return." "'Twas the very day he disappeared, the day you saw him?" Osmonde exclaimed. "Yes," was the answer given, as her Grace crossed the room, "and 'twas because I had seen him that the poor thing came to me with her story, and I cared for her." She, too, had been sitting at her embroidery frame, and had crossed the room for silks, which lay upon the table near to Mistress Anne. As she laid her hand upon them, she looked down and uttered a low exclamation, springing to her sister's side. "Anne, love!" she cried. "Nay, Anne!" Mistress Anne's small, worn face had dropped so low over her frame that it at last lay upon it, showing white against the silken roses so gaily broidered there. She was in a dead swoon. Later, Osmonde heard further details of this story, of how the poor child, having no refuge in the great city, had dared at last to go to Dunstanwolde House, in the wild hope that her ladyship, who had last seen Sir John, might tell her if he had let drop any word concerning his journey, if he had made one. She had at first hung long about the servants' entrance, watching the workmen who were that day walling in the wing of black cellars my lady had wished to close before she left the place, and at length, in desperation, had appealed to a young stonemason with a good-humoured countenance, and he had interceded for her with a lackey passing by. "But had I not spoke Sir John's name?" the girl said when my lord Duke spoke kindly to her of her story and her Grace's goodness. "Had I not spoke his name, the man would not have carried my message. But he said she would see me if I had news of Sir John Oxon. He blundered, your Grace, thinking I came from Sir John himself, and told her Grace 'twas so, and she bade him bring me to her." Her Grace she worshipped, and would break here into sobs each time she told the story, describing her fright when she had been led to the apartment where sat the great lady, who had spoke to her in a voice like music, and with such strange, deep pity of her grief, and in a passion of tenderness had told the truth to her, taking her, after her swoon, in her own strong, lovely arms, as if she had been no rich countess, but a poor woman, such as she who wept, and one whose heart, too, might have been broken by a cruel, deadly blow. This poor simple child, who was in time cured of her wound and married an honest fellow who loved her, was not the only one of Sir John Oxon's victims whom her Grace protected. There were, indeed, many of them, and 'twas as though she had made it her curious duty to search them out. When she and her lord lived sumptuously at Osmonde House in town, shining at court, entertaining royalty itself at their home, envied and courted by all as the happiest married lovers and the favourites of fortune, my lord Duke knew that many a day she cast her rich robes and, clad in the dark garments and black hood, went forth to visit strange, squalid places. Since the hour of his first meeting her on her return from such an errand, when they had spoken together, he had never again forbade her to follow the path 'twas plain she had chosen. "Were I going forth to battle," he had said, "you would not seek to hold me back. And in your battle, for it seems one to me, though I know not what 'tis fought for, I will not restrain you." "Ay, 'tis a battle," she had said, and seized his hands and kissed them as if in passionate gratitude. "And 'tis a debt I swore to pay, if that we call God would let me. Perhaps he will not, but were he you, who knew my soul, he would." Yet but a few hours later, when he joined her in the Mall, where she had descended from her coach to walk with the world of fashion, and moved among the wits and beaux and the leaders of the mode, drawing all round her by the marvel of her spirit and the brilliancy of her gaiety and bearing, he, hearing her rich laughter and meeting the bright look of her lovely flashing eyes, wondered if she was the woman whose voice still lingered in his ears and the memory of whose words would not leave his fervent heart. Their love was so perfect a thing that they had never denied each other aught. Why should they? Indeed, how could they? Each so understood and trusted the other that they scarce had need for words in the deciding of such questions as other pairs must reason gravely over. There was no question, only one thought between them, and in his life a thing which grew each hour as he had long since known it would. 'Twas this woman whom he loved, this one, her looks, her ways, her laughter and her tears, her very faults, if she should have them, her past, her present and her future, which seemed all himself. That, Duchess of Osmonde though she might be, she was known in dark places and moved among the foul evil there, like the sun which strove at rare hours to cleanse and dispel it; that she had in kennels and noisome dens strange friends, was a thing at first vaguely rumoured, because the world had ever loved its stories of her, and been ready to believe any it heard, and invent new ones when it had tired of the old. But there came a time when through a strange occurrence the rumour was proved most singularly to be a truth. Two gilt coaches, full of chattering fine ladies and gentlemen, were being driven on a certain day through a part of the town not ordinarily frequented by fashion, but the occupants of the coaches had been entertaining themselves with a great and curious sight it might have been their delicate fancy to desire to behold as an exciting novelty. This had been no less an exhibition than the hanging of two malefactors on Tyburn Hill, the one a handsome young highwayman, the other a poor woman executed for larceny. The highwayman had been a favourite and had died gaily, and that he should have been cut off in his prime had put the crowd, among which were several of his yet uncaught companions, in an ill humour. The poor woman had wept and made a poor end, which had added to the anger of the beholders. 'Twas an evil, squalid, malodorous mob, not of the better class of thieves and tatterdemalions, but of the worst, being made up of cut throats out of luck, pickpockets, and poor wretches who were the scourings of the town and the refuse of the kennel. 'Twas just the crowd to be roused to some insensate frenzy, being hungry, bitter, and vicious, and when, making ready to slouch back to its dens, its attention was attracted by the gay coaches, with their liveries and high-fed horses, and their burden of silks and velvets and plumes nodding over laughing, care-free, selfish faces, it fell into a sudden fit of animal rage. 'Twas a woman who began it. She had been a neighbour of the one who had just met punishment, and in her own hovel at that moment lay hid stolen goods. She was a wild thing, with a battered face and unkempt hair. Her rags hung about her waving, and she had a bloodshot, fierce eye. "Look!" she screamed out suddenly, high and shrill. "Look at them in their gold coaches, riding home from Tyburn, where they've seen their betters swing." The ladies in the chariots, pretty, heartless fools, started affrighted in their seats, and strove to draw back. Their male companions, who were as pretty, effeminate fools themselves, and of as little spirit, started also, and began to look pale about the gills. "Look at them!" shrieked the virago, "shivering like rabbits. A pretty end they would make if they were called to dance at a rope's end. Look ye at them with their white faces and their swords and periwigs." And she stood still, waving her arms, and poured forth a torrent of curses. 'Twas enough. The woman beside her looked and began to shake her fist, seized by the same frenzy. Her neighbour caught up her cry, her neighbour hers. A sodden-faced thief broke into a howling laugh. Another followed him. The madness spread from side to side, and in a moment the big, foul crowd surged about the coaches, shrieking blasphemies and obscenities, shaking fists, howling cries of shame and threats of violence. "Turn over the coaches, drag them out, tear their finery from them, stuff their mincing mouths with mud," rose all about them. The servants were dragged from their seats and hauled from side to side. Their liveries were in ribbons, their terrified faces, ghastly with terror and streaming with blood, might be seen one moment in one place, the next in another. Sometimes they seemed down on the ground. The crowd roared with rage and laughter at their cries. One lady swooned with terror. One or two crouched on the floor of the coach. The dandies gesticulated and called for help. "They will kill us! They will kill us!" screamed the finest beau among them. "The watch! The watch! The constables!" "'Tis worse than the Mohocks!" cried another, but his hand so shook he could not have drawn his sword if he had dared. The next instant the glass of the first coach was smashed and its door beaten open. A burly fellow seized upon a shrieking beauty and dragged her forth laughing, dealing her gallant a mighty clout on the face as he caught her. Blood spouted from the poor gentleman's delicate aquiline nose, and the mob danced and yelled. "Drag 'em all out!" was roared by the sodden-faced thief. "The women to the women and the men to the men, and then change about." The creatures were like wild beasts, and their prey would have been torn to pieces, but at that moment, from a fellow at the edge of the crowd, broke a startled oath. Someone had made way to him and laid a strong hand on his shoulder, and there was that in his cry which made those nearest turn. A tall figure in black draperies stood towering above him, and in truth above all the rest of the crowd. 'Twas a woman, and she called out to the mad creatures about her in command. "Fools!" she cried, "have a care. Do you want to swing at a rope's end yourselves?" 'Twas a fierce voice, the voice of a brave creature who feared none of them, though 'twas a rich voice and a woman's, and so rang with authority that it actually checked the tempest for a moment and made the leaders turn to look. She made her way nearer and threw back her hood from her face. "I am Clorinda Merton, who is Duchess of Osmonde," she cried to them. "There are many of you know me. Call back your senses and hearken to what I say." The ladies afterwards in describing the scene used to quake as they tried to paint this moment. "There was a cry that was like a low howl," they said, "as if beasts were baffled and robbed of their prey. Some of them knew her and some did not, but they all stood and stared. Good Lord, 'twas her great black eyes that held them, but I shall be affrighted when I think of her till my dying day." 'Twas her big black eyes and the steady flame in them that held the poor frenzied fools, perchance as wolves are said to be held by the eye of man sometimes. But 'twas another thing, and on that she counted. She looked round them from one face to the other. "You know me," she said to one, "and you, and you, and you," nodding at each. "I can pick out a dozen of you who know me, and should find more if I marked you all. How many here are my friends and servants?" There was a strange hoarse chorus of sounds. There were the voices of women who were poor bedraggled drabs, men who were thieves and cutthroats, a few shrill voices of lads who were pickpockets and ripe for the gallows already. "Ay, we know thee. Ay, Grace, ay," they cried, some in half sullen grunts, some as if half affrighted, but all in the tones of creatures who suddenly began to submit to a thing they wondered at. Then the woman who had begun the turmoil suddenly fell down on her knees and began to kiss her Grace's garments with hysteric, choking sobs. "She said thou wert the only creature had ever spoke her fair," she cried. "She said thou hadst saved her from going distraught when she lay in the gale. Just before the cart was driven away she cried out sobbing, 'Oh Lord! Oh your Grace!' and they thought her praying, but I knew she prayed to thee." The Duchess put her hand on the woman's greasy foul shoulder and answered in a strange voice, nodding her head, her black brows knit, her red mouth drawn in. "'Tis over now," she said. "'Tis over, and she quiet, and perchance ere this she has seen a fair thing. Poor soul, poor soul." By this time the attacked party had gained strength to dare to move. The pretty creature who had been first dragged forth from the coach uttered a shriek and fell on her knees, clutching at her rescuer's robe. "Oh, your Grace, your Grace!" she wept. "Have mercy, have mercy!" "Mercy!" said her Grace, looking down at the tower of powdered hair decked with gewgaws. "Mercy! Sure we all need it. Your ladyship came for sport to see a woman hang? I saw her in the gale last night waiting her doom, which would come with the day's dawning. 'Twas not sport. Had you been there with us, you would not have come here to day. Get up, my lady, and return to your coach. Make way there," raising her voice. "Let that poor fellow," pointing to the ashen faced coachman, "mount to his place. Be less disturbed, Sir Charles," to the trembling fop. "My friends will let you go free." And that they did, strangely enough, though 'twas not willingly, the victims knew, as they huddled into their places, shuddering, and were driven away, the crowd standing glaring after them, a man or so muttering blasphemies, though none made any movement to follow, but loitered about and cast glances at her Grace of Osmonde, who waited till the equipages were well out of sight and danger. "'Twas wasted rage," she said to those about her. "The poor light fools were not worth ill usage." The next day the Duke heard the tale which had flown abroad over the town. His very soul was thrilled by it, and that it told him, and he went to her Grace and poured forth to her a passion of love that was touched with awe. "I could see you," he cried, "when they told the story to me. I could see you as you stood there and held the wild beasts at bay. 'Twas that I saw in your child eyes when you rode past me in the hunting field. 'Twas that fire which held them back, and the great sweet soul of you which has reached them in their dens and made you worshipped of them." "'Twas that they know me," she answered. "'Twas that I have stood by their sides in their blackest hours. I have seen their children born. I have helped their old ones and their young through death. Some I have saved from the gallows, some I have " She stopped and hung her head as if black memories overpowered her. He knew what she had left unfinished. "You have been to comfort those who lie in Newgate at their last extremity," he ended for her. "Ay," she answered, "the one who will show kindness to them in those awful hours they worship as God's self. There was a poor fellow I once befriended there." She spoke slowly and her voice shook. "He was condemned for taking a man's life. The last night before I left him, he knelt to me and swore He had meant not murder. He had struck in rage. One who had tortured him with taunts till he went raving. He struck, and the man fell. And he had killed him, and now must hang. "Good God!" cried my lord Duke. "By chance! In frenzy! Not knowing! And he died for it?" "Ay," she answered, her great eyes Chapter 31 of His Grace of Osmonde by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31 Their Graces keep their wedding day at Camylott. "She came to court at last, my lord Duke," said his Grace of Marlborough. "She came at last, as I felt sure 'twas fate she should." 'Twas at Camylott he said this, where he had come in those days which darkened about him when, royal favour lost, the acclamations of a fickle public stilled, its clamour of applause almost forgot and denied by itself. His glory as a statesman, commander, warrior, seemed to sink beneath the horizon like a sunset in a winter sky. His splendid frame shattered by the stroke of illness, his heart bereaved, his great mind dulled and saddened. There were few friends faithful to him. But my Lord Duke of Osmonde, who had never sought his favour or required his protection, who had often held views differing from his own, and hidden none of them, was among the few in whose company he found solace and pleasure. "I see you as I was," he would say. "Nay, rather as I might have been had Nature given me a thing she gave to you and withheld from John Churchill. You were the finer creature and less disturbed by poor worldly dreams." So more than once he came to be guest at Camylott, and would be moved to pleasure by the happiness and fullness of life in the very air of the place, by the joyousness of the tall, handsome children, by the spirit and sweet majesty of the tall beauty their mother, by the loveliness of the country and the cheerful air of well-being among the villagers and tenantry. But most of all, he gave thought to the look which dwelt in the eyes of my lord Duke and the woman who was so surely mate and companion, as well as wife to him. When, though 'twas even at the simplest moment, each looked at the other, 'twas a heavenly thing plain to see. Upon one of their wedding days he was at Camylott with them. 'Twas but a short time before the quiet death of Mistress Anne, and was the 10th anniversary of their Graces' union. At Camylott they always spent their anniversary, though upon their other domains the rejoicings which made Camylott happy were also held. These festivities were gay and rustic, including the pealing of church bells, the lighting of bonfires, rural games and feastings. But they were most noted for the feature her Grace herself had invented before she had yet been 12 months a wife, and 'twas a pretty fancy, too, as well as a kind thought. She had talked of it at first to her husband one summer afternoon as they walked together in the gold glow of sunset through Camylott woods. 'Twas one of many happy hours shared with her which he remembered to his life's end, and could always call up in his mind the deep amber light filtering through the trees, the thick green growth of the ferns and the scent of them, the moss underfoot and on the huge fallen trunk they at last sat down upon. "To every man, woman, and child we rule over," she said, "on that day we will give a wedding gift. As the year passes, we will discover what each longs for most, and that thing we will give. So on that heavenly day each one shall have his heart's desire, in memory," she added with a soft solemnity. And he echoed her, "In memory," for neither at that time nor at any other did either of them forget those hours they had lived apart, and how fate had seemed to work them ill, and how they had been desolate and hungered. So on each morning of the wedding day, while the bells were ringing a peal, the flag flying from the tower, the park prepared for games and feasting, a crowd of ruddy countenances, clean smocks, petticoats, and red cloaks flocked on the terrace from which the gifts were given. 'Twas from his invalid chair within the library window that the once great commander sat and saw this sight. Her Grace standing by her husband at a long table, giving each gift with her own hand and saying a few words to each recipient with a bright freedom 'twas worth any man's while to see. The looker on remembered the histories he had heard of the handsome hoyden whose male attire had been the Gloucestershire scandal, the court beauty who in the midst of her triumphs had chosen to play gentle consort to an old husband, the Duchess who shone in the great world like the sun, and who yet doffed her brocades and jewels to don serge and canvas, and labour in rag yard and slaughter alley to rescue thieves and beggars, and watch the mothers of their hapless children in their throes. Ay, and more yet, to sit in the black condemned cell at Newgate and hold the hand and pour courage into the soul of a shuddering wretch who, in the cold grey of morning, would dangle from a gallows tree. "'Tis a strange nature," he thought, "and has ever been so. It has passed through some strange hours and some dark ones, yet to behold her." There had come to her side a young couple, the woman with the child in her arms curtseying blushingly, her youthful husband grinning and pulling his forelock. Her Grace took the infant and cuddled and kissed it, while its father and mother glowed with delight. "'Tis a fine boy, Betty," she said. "'Tis bigger than the last one, Tom. His christening finery is in the package here, and I will stand sponsor as before." "Mother," said young John at her elbow, "may I not stand sponsor too?" She laughed and pulled his long love locks. "Ay, my lord Marquis," she answered, "if his parents are willing to take such a young one." Mistress Anne sat by their guest, he holding her in great favour. As the people came for their gifts, she told him their names and stories. Through weakness she walked about but little in these days, and the failing soldier liked her company, so she often sat near him in her lounging chair, and with gentle artfulness lured him into reminiscence of his past campaigns. She was very frail to day, and in her white robe, and with her large eyes, which seemed to have outgrown her face, she looked like the wraith of a woman rather than a creature of flesh and blood. "Those two her Grace rescued," she said, as Betty and Tom Beck retired. "The one from woe, the other from cruel wickedness. He had betrayed the poor child and deserted her, and 'twas her Grace who touched his heart and woke manhood in it, and made them happy man and wife. Then came an old woman leading a girl and boy, both fair and blooming, and with blue eyes and fair curling locks. "Are they both well and both happy, dame?" the Duchess asked. "Yes, that they are, I see, and I know they are both good." She took the girl's face in both hands and smiled into it as she might have smiled at a flower, and then kissed her tenderly. She gave her a little new gown and a pretty huswife stocked with implements to make it. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at him as his mother would have looked had she been tender of him. "For you, Robin," she said, "there are books. I know 'tis books and learning you long for, and you shall have them. His Grace's chaplain has promised me to teach you." The boy clasped the books under his arm, hugging them against his breast, and when her Grace turned to the next newcomer he seized a fold of her robe and kissed it. "Who are those children?" the Captain General asked. "They do not look like rustics." "Those two she rescued also," answered Mistress Anne in a low voice. "She found them in a thieves' haunt being trained as pickpockets. They are the cast off offspring of a gentleman who lived an evil life." "Was she told his name?" "Yes," Mistress Anne said, lower still. "'Twas a gentleman who was lost, Sir John Oxon." The mystery of this gentleman's disappearance was a thing forgotten, but Mistress Anne's hearer recalled it, and that the man had left an evil reputation, and that 'twas said that in the first bloom of his youth he had been among the worshippers of the Gloucestershire beauty, and there passed through the old Duke's mind a vague wonder as to whether the Duchess remembered girlish sentiments the hoyden had lived through and forgot. It seemed the man's name being once drawn from the past was not to be allowed to rest, for later in the day he heard of him again, and curiously indeed. There came in the afternoon from town a sturdy, loud voiced country gentleman, with a red, honest face and a good humoured eye, and he was so received by the family, by his Grace, who shook him warmly by the hand, by the Duchess, who gave him both hers to kiss, and by the young ones, who cried out in rejoicing over him, that their distinguished guest perceived him to be an old friend who was, as it were, an old comrade, and so it proved, for 'twas soon revealed to him by the gentleman himself, whose name was Sir Christopher Crowell, and whose estates lay on the borders of Warwickshire and Gloucestershire, that he had been one of the boon companions of her Grace's father, Sir Geoffrey Wildairs, and he had known her from the time she was 5 years old, and had been first made the comrade and plaything of a band of the worst rioters in 3 counties. "Ay," he cried exultantly, for he seemed always exultant when he spoke of her Grace, who was plainly his idol. "At 7 she would toss off her ale and sing and swear as wickedly as any man among us, and had great black eyes that flashed fire when we crossed her, and her hair hung below her waist, and she was the most beauteous child devil and the most lawless that man or woman ever clapped eyes on. And to behold her now, to behold her now!" And then he motioned towards the little Anne, who was flashing eyed and long limbed and a brown beauty. "'Tis my Lady Anne who is most like her," he said, "but Lord, she hath been treated fair by fortune, and loved and cherished, and is a young queen already." Later, when the night had fallen and was thick with stars, and the festal lights were twinkling like other stars among the trees of the park, and from the happy crowds at play there floated the sounds of laughter and joyful voices, their Graces and their guests sat or walked upon the terrace amid the night scents of flowers and watched the merriment going on below them and talked together. "Ay," broke forth old Sir Christopher, "you two happy folk light joyful fires and make joyful hearts wheresoever you go." 'Twas at this moment two of the other country guests, they being old Gloucestershire comrades also, stayed their sauntering before her Grace to speak to her. "Eldershawe and me have just been saying," broke forth one of them, chuckling, "how this bringeth back old times, though 'tis little like them. We three were of the birthnight party, Eldershawe, Chris, and me. Thou dost not forget old friends, Clo, and would not, wert thou 10 times a duchess." "Nay, not I," answered her Grace, "not I." "There be not many of us left," said Sir Christopher, ruefully. "Thy poor old dad is under sod, and others with him. 2 necks were broken hunting, the others died of years or drink." "But one we know not of, egad," said my Lord Eldershawe, "and he was my kinsman." "Lord, yes," cried out the other, "Jack Oxon. Jack, who came among us all curls and essences and brocades and lace. Thou art not forgot Jack Oxon, Clo, for the fellow was wild in love with thee." "No, I have not forgotten Sir John," she answered, and turned aside a little to break a rose from a bush near her and hold it to her face. "Nay, that she hath not," cried Sir Christopher. "That I can swear to. I saw the boy and girl to day, Clo, and Lord, how they are like to him." "Yes, they are like him," she answered, gravely. "The two thou showedst me playing 'neath the trees?" said Eldershawe. "Ay, they are like enough." "And but for her Grace would have been brought up a hangdog thief and a poor drab with all their beauty," went on Sir Christopher. "Ecod, thou hast done well, Clo, the task 'twas thy whim to take upon thyself." "What generous deed was that?" asked my Lord Duke of Osmonde, drawing near. "The task of undoing the wrongs a villain had done, if 'twere so there could be undoing of them," answered the old fellow. "A woman rich as I," said she, "should set herself some good work to do. This shall be mine, to live John Oxon's life again, and make it bring forth good instead of evil." Her Grace sat motionless, and so did Mistress Anne, who had sunk back in her chair, and in the starlit darkness had grown more white, and was breathing faint and quickly. In the park below the people laughed as merrymakers will, in gay bursts, and half a dozen voices broke forth into a snatch of song. 'Twas a good background for Sir Christopher, who was well launched upon a subject that he loved and had not often chanced to hold forth upon, as her Grace was not fond of touching upon it. 10 years hath she followed his wicked footsteps, and I have followed with her," he rambled on. "I am not squeamish, the Lord knoweth, and have no reason to be, but had I known when I began to aid in the searching what mire I should have to wade through, ecod, I think I should have said, 'Let ill alone.'" "But you did not, old friend," said the Duchess's rich, low voice. "You did not." Lady Betty and her swains had sauntered near and joined the circle, attracted by the subject which waked in them a new interest in an old mystery. "You have been her Grace's almoner, Sir Christopher," said her ladyship. "That accounts for the stories I have heard of your charities. They were her Grace's good deeds, not your own." "She knew I would sweep the kennel for her on hands and knees if she would have me," said Sir Chris, "and at the first of it she knew not the ill quarters of the town as I did, and bade me make search for her and ask questions. But 'twas not long before she found her way herself,
and learnt that a tall, strong beauty can do more to reach hearts than a red-faced old man can. Lord, how they love and fear her! And among the honest folk Jack Oxon wronged, poor tradesmen he ruined by his trickery, and simple working folk who lost their all through him. They would kiss the dust her shoe hath trod. His debts she hath paid, his victims she hath rescued, the wounds he dealt she hath healed and made sound flesh, and for 10 years she hath done it." Her Grace rose to her feet, the rose uplifted in a listening gesture. From the park below there floated up the lilting music of a dance, a light, unrustic measure played by their own musicians. "The dancing begins," she said. "Hark! The dancing begins." Mistress Anne put out her hand and caught at her sister's dress, and held a fold of its richness in her trembling hand, though her Grace was not aware of what she did. "How sweet the music sounds!" the poor gentlewoman said nervously. "How sweet it sounds!" My Lady Betty Tantillion held up her hand as the Duchess, a moment since, had held the rose. "I have heard that tune before," she cried. "And I," said Lord Charles. "And I," Sir Harry Granville echoed. Lady Betty broke into a shiver. "Why," she cried, "how strange! At just this moment. We danced to it at the ball at Dunstanwolde House the very night 'twas made known Sir John Oxon had disappeared." The Duchess held the rose poised in her hand and slowly bent her head. "Yes," she said, "'tis the very tune." She stood among them, my Lord Duke remembered it later, the centre figure of a sort of circle, some sitting, some standing, his Grace of Marlborough, Mistress Anne, Osmonde himself, the country gentlemen, my Lady Betty and her swains, and others who drew near. She was the centre, standing in the starlight, her rose held in her hand. "Lord, 'twas a strange thing," said Sir Christopher thoughtfully, "that a man could disappear like that and leave no trace no trace." "Has all inquiry ceased?" her Grace asked quietly. "There was not much even at first, save from his creditors," said Lord Charles with a laugh. "Ay, but 'twas strange," said old Sir Christopher. "I've thought and thought what could have come of him." "Why, Clo, thou wast the one who saw him last. What dost thou think?" In the park below there was a sudden sweet swelling of the music. The dancers had joined in with their voices. "Yes," said the Duchess, "'twas I who saw him last." And for a few seconds all paused to listen to the melody in the air, but Sir Christopher came back to his theme. "What sort of humour was the man in?" he asked. "Did he complain of a lot?" Her Grace hesitated a second, as one who thought, and then shook her head. "No," she answered, and no other word. "Did he speak of taking a journey?" said Lady Betty. And the Duchess shook her head slow again, and answered as before, "No." And the music swelled with fresh added voices, and floated up gayer and more sweet. "Was he dressed for travel?" asked Lord Charles, he being likely to think first of the meaning of a man's dress. "No," said her Grace. And then my Lord Duke drew near behind her and spoke over her shoulder. "Did he bid you any farewell?" he said. She had not known he was so close, and gave a great start and dropped her rose upon the terrace. Before she answered, she stooped herself and picked it up. "No," she said very low. "No, none." "Then," his Grace said, I will tell you what I think." "You?" said my Lady Betty. "Has your Grace thought?" "Often," he answered. "Who has not, at some time? I knew more of the man than many. More than once his life touched mine." "Yours!" they cried. He waved his hand with the gesture of a man who would sweep away some memory. "Yes," he said, "once I saw the end of a poor soul he had maddened, and 'twas a cruel thing." He turned his face towards his wife. "The morning that he left your Grace," he said. "'Tis my thought. He went not far." "Not far!" the party exclaimed. But the Duchess joined not in the chorus. "Between Dunstanwolde House and his lodgings," he went on, "lie some of the worst haunts in London. He was well known there, and not by friends, but by enemies. Perchance some tortured creature who owed him a bitter debt may have lain in wait and paid it." The Duchess turned and gazed at him with large eyes. "What?" she said, almost hoarsely. "What do you mean?" "There were men," he answered gravely, "husbands, fathers, and brothers. There were women he had driven to despair and madness, who might well have struck him down." "You mean," said her Grace, almost in a whisper, "you mean that he was murdered?" "Nay," he replied, "not murdered. Struck a frenzied blow and killed, and it might have been by one driven mad with anguish and unknowing what he did." Her Grace caught her breath. "As 'twas with the poor man I told you of," she broke forth, as if in eagerness. "The one who died on Tyburn Tree?" "Yes," was his answer. "Perhaps you are right," she said, and passed her hand across her brow. "Perhaps you are right." "But there was found no trace," Sir Christopher cried out. "No trace." "Ah," said my Lord Duke slowly, "that is the mystery. A dead man's body is not easy hid." The Duchess broke forth laughing almost wildly. The whole group started at the sound. "Nay, nay," she cried, "what dark things do we talk of? Sir Christopher, Sir Christopher, 'twas you who set us on. A dead man's body is not easy hid." "'Tis enough to make a woman shudder," cried Lady Betty hysterically. "Yes," said her Grace. "See, I am shuddering. I, who am built of Wilder's iron and steel." And she held out her hands to them, her white hands, and indeed they were trembling like leaves. The evil thing they had spoke of had surely sunk deep into her soul and troubled it, though she had so laughed and lightly changed the subject of their talk. For in the night she had an awful dream, and her lord wakened from deep slumber, as he had been once before, started up to behold her standing in the middle of the chamber, a tall white figure with its arms outflung as if in wild despair, while she cried out in frenzy to the darkness. "I have killed thee! I have killed thee!" she wailed, "though I meant it not. Even hell itself doth know. Thou art a dead man, and this is the worst of all." "'Tis a dream!" he cried aloud to her, and clutched her in his warm, strong arms. "'Tis a dream, a dream! Awake, awake, awake!" And she awoke and fell upon her knees, sobbing as those who sob are roused from such a horror. "A dream, a dream, a dream!" she cried. "And 'tis you awake me.
You, Gerald, Gerald." Chapter 32 of His Grace of Osmonde by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32 In the Turret Chamber and in Camylott Wood. When the great soldier returned to Blenheim Castle, his Grace of Osmonde bore him company, and having spent a few days in his society at that great house, returned to town, from whence he came again to Camylott. He reached there on a heavenly day, which seemed to him more peaceful and more sweet than any day the summer had so far brought, though it had been a fair one. Many days had been bright and full of flower scent and rustling of green leaves, and overarched by tender blueness, with white clouds softly floating therein, but this one, as he rode, he thought held something in its beauty which seemed to make the earth seem nearer heaven, and heaven more fair to lifted mortal eyes. He thought this as his horse bore him over the white road. He thought it as he rode across the moor. 'Twas in his mind as he passed through the village, and saw the white cottages standing warm and peaceful in the sunshine, with goodwives at the doors or at their windows, and children playing on the green, who stopped and bobbed curtsies to him or pulled their forelocks, grinning. Joan Bush was at her gate, and stepped out and dipped a curtsy with appealing civility. "Your Grace," she said, "if I might make so bold, poor Mistress Anne," and having said so much, checked herself in much confusion. "I lose my wits," she said. "Your Grace's pardon. Your Grace has been to town, and but now comes back, and will not know, but we so love the kind gentlewoman," and she mopped her eyes. "You mean that Mistress Anne is worse?" he said. "The poor lady fell into a sudden strange swoon but an hour ago," she answered. "My Matthew, who was at the Tower of an errand, said she came in from the flower garden and sank lifeless, and the servants who carried her to her chamber say 'twas like death, and she hath been so long fading, and we know full well the end must come soon." My Lord Duke rode on. A fullness tightened his throat, and he looked up at the blue sky. "Poor Anne, kind Anne," he said. "Pure heart. I could think 'twas for the passing of her soul the day was made so fair." At the park gates the woman from the lodge stood at her door and made her obeisance cheerfully. She was an honest soul to whom her Grace's sister seemed a saint from heaven. "What is the last news?" said my Lord Duke, speaking more from kindness than aught else. "That the dear lady lies in her bed in the turret chamber, and her Grace watches with her alone. Oh, my Lord Duke, God calls another angel to Himself this day." The very air was still with a strange stillness. The tower itself rose white and clear against the blue, as though its battlements and fair turrets might be part of the eternal city. This strange fancy passed through his Grace's mind as he rode towards it. The ivy hung thick about the window of Anne's chamber in the South Tower. 'Twas a room she loved and had spent long peaceful days in, and had fitted as a little shrine. Her lovingness had taught her to feed the doves from it, and they had grown to be her friends and companions. And now a little cloud of them flew about and lighted on the turrets and clung to the festoons of ivy, and flew softly about as if they were drawn to the place by some strange knowledge, and waited for that which was to come to pass. 2 or 3 sat upon the deep window ledge and cooed as if they told those not so near what they could see inside the quiet room. On the terrace below the elder children stood, John and Gerald and Daphne and Anne. They waited, too, as the doves did, and their young faces were lifted that they might watch the window, and they were very sweet and gravely tender, and unafraid and fair. When their father drew near them, 'twas the child Daphne who spoke, putting her hand in his and meeting his eyes with a lovely look. "Father," she said, "we think that Mother Anne lies dying in her room. We are not afraid. Mother has told us that to die is only as if a bird was let to fly out into the blue sky. And Mother is with her, and we are waiting because we think, perhaps, we are not sure, but perhaps we might see her soul fly out of the window like a white bird. It seems as if the doves were waiting too." My Lord Duke kissed her and passed on. "You may see it," he said gently. "Who knows? And if you see it, sure it will be white." And he went quietly through the house and up the staircase leading to Anne's tower chamber, and the pretty apartment her Grace had prepared for her so lovingly to spend quiet hours in when she would be alone. This apartment led into the chamber, but now it was quite empty, for the Duchess was with her sister, who lay on the bed in the room within, where the ivy hung in festoons about the high window, which seemed to look up into the blue sky itself, and shut out all the earth below, and only look on heaven. To enter seemed like entering some sacred shrine where a pure saint lay, and upon the threshold his Grace lingered, almost fearing to go in and break upon the awful tenderness of this last hour, and the last words he heard the loving creature murmuring while the being she had so worshipped knelt beside her. "'Twas love," he heard. "'Twas love. What matter if I gave my soul for you?" He drew back with a quick, sad beat of the heart. Poor, tender soul! Poor woman who had loved and given no sign, and only in her dying dared to speak. And then there came a cry, and 'twas the voice of her he loved, and he stood spellbound. 'Twas a cry of anguish, of fear, of horror and dismay. 'Twas her voice as he heard it ring out in the blackness of her dream. Her dear voice, harsh with woe and broken into moaning. Her dear voice, which he had heard murmuring love to him, crooning over her children, laughing like music. And the torrent of words which she poured forth made his blood cold. And yet as they fell upon his ear, he knew, yes, now he knew, revealed no new story to him, even though it had been until that hour untold. No, 'twas not new, for through many an hour when he had marked the shadow in her eyes, he had vaguely guessed some fatal burden lay upon her soul, and had striven to understand. "And then I struck him with my whip," he heard, "knowing nothing, not seeing, only striking like a goaded, dying thing, and he fell, and all was done." None heard or saw my Lord Duke when, later, he passed out from the empty room. He went forth into the fair day again, and through the park and into Camylott Wood. The deep amber light was there, and the gold green stillness, and he passed onward till he reached the great wood's depths, and stood beneath an oak tree's broad spread branches, leaning his back against the huge rough trunk, his arms folded. This was her secret burden, this,
and nature had so moulded him that he could look upon it with just, unflinching eyes, his soul filled with a godlike, awful pity. In a walled-in cellar in the deserted Dunstanwolde house lay, waiting for the call of Judgment Day, a handful of evil dust which once had been a man, one whose each day of life from his youth upward had seemed, as it had passed, to leave black dregs in some poor fellow creature's cup. One frantic, unthinking blow struck in terror and madness had ended him and all his evil doing, but left her standing frenzied at the awfulness of the thing which had fallen upon her soul in her first hour of heaven. And all her being had risen in revolt at this most monstrous woe of chance, and in her torture she had cried out that in that hour she would not be struck down. "Of ending his base life I had never thought," he had heard her wail, "though I had thought to end my own. But when fate struck the blow for me, I swore that carrion should not taint my whole life through." To atone for this, she had lived her life of passionate penance. Remembering this, she had prayed Heaven strike and blight her, in fear that she herself should blight the noble and the innocent things she loved. And while she had thought she bore the burden all alone, the gentle sister, who had so worshipped her, had known her secret and borne it with her silently. In dying she had revealed it, with trembling and piteous love, and this my lord Duke had heard, and her pure words as she had died. "Anne, Anne," the anguished voice had cried, "must he know, my Gerald? Must I tell him all? If so, I must, I will, upon my knees." "Nay, tell him not," was faintly breathed in answer. "Let God tell him, who understands." "'Tis in myself," my lord Duke said at last, through his shut teeth. "'Tis in myself to have struck the blow, and had I done it and found him lie dead before me, in her dear name I swear, and in a new shriven soul's presence, for sure the pure thing is near, I would have hid it as she has done, for naught should have torn her from me. And for her sin, if sin it is counted, I will atone with her, and as she does her penance, will do mine. And if, at the end of all things, she be called to judgment bar, I will go with her and stand by her side. For her life is my life, and her soul my soul, her sentence my sentence, and being her love, I will bear it with her, and pray Him who judges to lay the burden heavier upon me than upon her." And he went back to the Tower and up the stairway to the turret chamber, and there Mistress Anne lay still and calm and sweet as a child asleep, and flowers and fair chaplets lay all about her white bed, and on her breast, and in her small worn hands, and garlanded her pillow. And the setting sun had sent a shaft of golden glory through the window to touch her hair and the blossoms lying on it. And her sister stood beside her and looked down, and a new peace was on her face when she laid her cheek upon her husband's breast as he enfolded her. "She is my saint," she said. "To-day she has taken my sins in her pure hands to God, and has asked mercy on them. And having done so, dear heart," he answered her, "she lies amid her flowers and smiles." But of that he had overheard he said no word, and if as time passed there came some sacred hour when, their souls being one, there could be no veil not rent away by love and nature, and the secret each had kept was revealed to the other, 'twas surely so revealed as but to draw them closer and fill them with higher nobleness, for no other human creature heard of it or guessed. So it befell that one man met his deserts by chance, and none were punished, and only good grew out of his evil grave. And should there be a power who for strange high reasons calls forth helpless souls from peaceful nothingness to relentless life, and judges all life does and leaves undone, 'tis surely safe to trust its honesty and justice. End of Chapter 32. Recorded by Linda Andress. Waukesha,